private companies responding to the global crisis? We're about to find out in my conversation today with Brian Umbenhauer. He is leader for consulting with Deloitte Private. Hello, Brian.
Bob, how are you? Thanks for the invitation.
Good, and thank you very much for being with me today. So, Deloitte Private has published its third report on the global private company market. What are these reports designed to find out?
Thanks, Bob, for teeing it up. And again, thanks for having me. We couldn't be more thrilled with this year's report. This year, we surveyed about 3,000 companies, about 33 of them around the world, roughly between 10 million and 1 billion, US dollar organizations, just to give you a frame of reference of what we're talking about here. And that we really wanted to understand with these organizations is, how are they showing up? Not only pre-pandemic, but, in the midst of the pandemic and hopefully what we are now seeing on the back end of it. This study in particular was focused on some of the observations that we had seen in the marketplace around resiliency and how these leading organizations are, powering through to the other side, hopefully for many of them emerging even stronger. Last thing I'll say is we broke it down really into 7 really key attributes and traits: strategy, growth, operations, technology, workforce, capital, and definitely last but not least is society, or more, ESG type of topics.
All things which are of concern to all businesses. Is there anything especially unique about the experience of private companies versus public companies in addressing these issues?
Bob, it's a great question. And, the great news, at least as it relates to my findings, is that it's one of the same. Some of these organizations, whether it be big or small, are still trying to rise to the occasion. And for those that are the higher performers or the most resilient, we are seeing some of the same characteristics and traits play out, be it public or private.
So these are tough times for everybody, and yet I get the feeling from your tone that you're seeing some optimistic, positive signs in terms of the observations of private companies in addressing today's crises. How is that the case? I mean, what are they seeing that's positive? What are they seeing that is allowing their supply chains to be more resilient in the face of these disruptions?
Look, if there is a silver lining in a global pandemic, one of those would be the adoption and the way these types of organizations have embraced transformational opportunities. If you look at the study and the results of it, it's almost broken into various quartiles. You have the top quartile, which are those organizations that had already started, but are using the pandemic to supercharge and get to the answers faster because they need to respond to the market, to all the dynamics, to foster new ecosystem relationships, sources of supply, et cetera. You got the other quartile at the very bottom, which is a bunch of organizations that haven't even thought about it yet. And they're actually trying to figure it out. Where do you start? How do you get started? But they know they need to do something. They just haven't gotten there yet. And then there's a whole lot. The other, 50% are sitting there in the middle at various stages of, grappling with how to take advantage of the situation they find themselves in to, again, emerge stronger on the other side.
I'm assuming that top quartile had already gone to work on some of these problems pre-pandemic. Is that correct?
Absolutely, absolutely. And the pandemic just gave them a really good reason, right, on why to invest in themselves, think differently, and to get after it even faster.
So for the others, though, the pandemic has served, I'm assuming, as some kind of a catalyst. Does that move some of that bottom quartile into the middle, maybe? Are some of these companies waking up and realizing the importance of taking these steps?
I think it is, Bob. I think it is. It's easy, right? With enough time, money, and capital, right? You can do a lot of good things. But for many of these medium to smaller size private organizations, they got to be wise about how they're investing their capital to drive, the types of returns on those investments that one would expect. And so we are absolutely seeing how a convergence of some of those resilience elements that I mentioned here at the top, those 7 different elements, are converging in topics like smart factory, which is becoming increasingly important around organizations and how they are taking all of those component pieces, stitching them together to hopefully show up in a differentiated way to be more attractive to their existing customer base and hopefully attracting new ones in the process.
When you use the adjective smart, I mean, how literal are you being in terms of very often these days that term is applied to artificial intelligence and technology. It could also be construed in a larger sense. What do you mean by a smart factory?
Look, the study suggested that 7 out of 10 companies have used the pandemic as a way to accelerate all of their digital transformation opportunities. And
Mm.
when we say digital, which I like to use the analogy, many organizations that have been around, right, have always been analog shops, right? They've been working for decades, right, to try to create digital shops by, bringing the digital and physical together. And now
Mhm.
that they've been working on that for an extended period of time, both in legacy brownfield environments as well as greenfield environments, or as things break and they install new technology enabled or digitized assets, they're now having the ability to stitch that data together in differentiating ways to create a smart environment, right? It's
Interesting.
the
Yeah.
analog to digital to smart journey. And that comes in, the shape of cloud, artificial intelligence, robotics. Obviously, cyber is a critical element that we're reading about in the headlines, what seems to be almost every other day now. So they're really trying to harness, how do you take the best of the technology that's on this type of curve with the cost curve that's coming down, and finding that sweet point that they can take advantage of to obviously move the operational and financial metrics that matter to them as an organization.
Well, as we know, a factory, no matter how smart it might be, is not an island. It is a link, to mix a metaphor here, it's a link in a long chain with partners at either end. So, what do your private companies tell you about their ability or doing a better job of reaching up to multiple tiers of suppliers and involving them in a tighter type of relationship to allow for more resilient supply chains?
So this is a very important question, and it's a question that I get asked a lot, right? For many, many years, as sourcing and procurement organizations were trying to optimize what is the right supply-based structure to support their operations. What are the things that we're going to align on? Is it cost? Is it quality? Is it DEI? You
Mhm.
know, and I think the variables that went into making those selections, based on other surveys that we as an organization have done in the area of sourcing and procurement, we've done, I think we just announced our 10th annual Global Chief Procurement Officer Survey. If you look at the history of those surveys, you will see that almost the majority have always leaned towards cost, optimized cost. It's easy to evaluate, and that's what they're going to hang their hat on.
Yeah.
Well, what that has happened is, to do that, you got to create scale. To create scale, that could create a situation where in that node of that supply chain, you are creating a one-to-one or a sole sourced opportunity. Well, what did the pandemic teach us about that? What it taught us is that comes at a huge risk premium, right?
Mhm.
Yes, you might have eked out a couple of pennies on the dollar to put more capacity on the shoulders of that one contract vehicle. But what happened when that organization went belly up, or they ran into their own supply issues, right? And now we're seeing that again in the headlines day in and day out. And so as you double click into the resiliency story that I mentioned at the top of our conversation, I think it's really forcing supply chain professionals to rethink, is redundancy okay? Do we need to have those types of close-knit relationships where they are sole sourced, or is it okay to maybe not eke out every single dollar, to have
Mhm.
a dual source type of organizational relationship for those critical components that could obviously be a bottleneck in production capabilities? And so
Yeah.
I think that the pandemic is going to have a hangover effect, if you will, to use another analogy, right, around how organizations really value those criterion as they make supply decisions and choices.
One difference I think might distinguish a private from a public company, and I know that this is not an absolute truth, but to some extent, you think about private companies as being a little less pressured to show those quarterly results, higher results quarter by quarter, and have a little bit of a longer vision in terms of the investments they make. So are these private companies spending money? Do you think that they are willing to put out the money? And as you say, before it was all about cost. Now they have access to capital and they're using that access to do these things.
I think that's spot on. I think that's spot on. And what I've observed, Bob, is that they've been doing it even pre-pandemic,
Mhm.
right? And they continue. In my role as the private leader, I've had the privilege and opportunity to talk to many executives at some of these organizations where, sustainability, you could talk about, is somewhat in vogue right now. They've been doing it for a really, really long time. Matter of fact, some of them, depending on what type of manufacturing they are involved in, it actually has historically been a profit center for them, right? As they deal with like metal waste and recycling, as an example. And so, not that big organizations aren't doing that as well, but when you're talking about the size of organizations that participated in this year's survey, those dollars mean a whole lot to them in terms of how they think about reinvesting in themselves to continue to grow and show up differently with purpose.
Well, companies that are using the crisis as an opportunity, that's a really strong trend. And it's good to hear, Brian Umbenhauer, about what these private companies are doing and what they're thinking these days, how they're seeing global supply chains. Thanks so much for being with me today to talk a little bit about this report and give us these insights. I really appreciate your time.
Bob, it was a pleasure. Thank you.